By the summer of 1943, the United States Army arrived in the Mediterranean, carrying a reputation it had not earned. On paper, it was large, modern, and well-equipped. In reality, it was still an army learning how not to collapse under pressure. The shock had come only months earlier in Tunisia, where at Kasserine Pass German forces tore through inexperienced American units with alarming ease. Command structures froze, units retreated without coordination. Radios went silent at the worst moments. Tanks advanced without infantry. Infantry waited for orders that never came. Kasserine did not just expose tactical weakness, it exposed a system that could not absorb chaos. The Sicily campaign, officially Operation Husky, was never intended to be a decisive American proving ground. British planners viewed it as a transitional operation, a stepping stone toward Italy, where lessons could be learned at acceptable cost. The expectation was simple. The British Eighth Army would carry the main weight of the fighting, while American forces would secure flanks, ports, and ground already expected to collapse. For Washington, Sicily was about seasoning divisions, not showcasing brilliance. For many Allied commanders, it was assumed that the Americans would need time. Time was something the Germans had learned to exploit. Into this environment stepped George S. Patton, taking command of the U.S. Seventh Army. His appointment was not accidental, but neither was it a free vote of confidence. Patton was brought in precisely because the system had failed. His reputation for speed, discipline, and relentless pressure was seen as a corrective tool. The Army did not ask him to innovate. It asked him to impose order where none existed. What followed would go far beyond that mandate. The Seventh Army Patton inherited was structurally cautious. Orders flowed downward in layers. Initiative required permission. Officers were trained to avoid mistakes rather than exploit opportunities. Movement was planned on timetables, not conditions. This doctrine was survivable in training. In combat, it was lethal. Patton understood immediately that Sicily would not reward obedience. It would reward motion. But before motion could become doctrine, the Army had to survive its landing. On July 10, 1943, American forces came ashore on the southern coast of Sicily amid chaos. Weather scattered landing craft. Units arrived in the wrong sectors. Paratroopers were dropped miles from their objectives. German and Italian defenders, though surprised, reacted faster than expected. Nowhere was this clearer than at Gela. There, elements of the German Hermann Göring Division counterattacked aggressively, pushing armor toward the beaches, while American infantry struggled to hold ground they barely understood. At Gela, the weaknesses of the pre-Kasserine U.S. Army resurfaced. Units hesitated. Communications broke down. Junior officers waited for confirmation while German tanks closed distance. It was naval gunfire, not ground coordination, that prevented a collapse. Battleships firing over open sights stopped German armor where infantry could not. The lesson was brutal and unmistakable. Without speed and initiative, the Army would be saved only by assets it did not control. Patton was not physically present at every point of crisis. But the impact of Gela reshaped his approach instantly. He concluded that the Seventh Army could not afford doctrinal patience. Every delay created an opening for German reaction. Every pause invited counterattack. The Germans did not need to destroy American forces outright. They only needed to slow them long enough to regain coherence. From that moment, Patton began treating time as the primary battlefield currency. Sicily's terrain reinforced this urgency. The island was not suited to elegant set-piece operations. Narrow roads, mountainous interiors, and limited ports meant that logistics and maneuver were inseparable. Whoever controlled movement controlled the campaign. German commanders understood this. They did not plan to hold Sicily indefinitely. Their objective was to delay, extract forces, and preserve combat power for Italy. Every day gained mattered more than every mile held. The Allied plan did not fully account for this logic. It assumed that pressure alone would cause collapse. It underestimated German withdrawal discipline. Patton, however, recognized the pattern early. If the Germans were trading space for time, then the only way to defeat them was to deny both. That meant moving faster than their withdrawal timetable, seizing ports before demolitions, and forcing retreats before defenses could solidify. At this stage of the campaign, Patton was officially subordinate. His 7th Army was expected to protect Montgomery's flank while the British pushed east toward Messina. This hierarchy was clear on maps and orders, but less clear on the ground. Patton saw that the western half of Sicily was thinly defended and operationally undervalued. To most planners, it was irrelevant terrain. To Patton, it was freedom of maneuver. What mattered most in these opening days was not victory, but transformation. The 7th Army was still the same force that had stumbled in Tunisia, but its operating environment forced rapid adaptation. Officers began to realize that waiting was more dangerous than moving. Units that advanced aggressively encountered fewer prepared defenses than those that advanced cautiously. The battlefield itself started rewarding initiative, even before doctrine caught up. Patton reinforced this shift relentlessly. Orders emphasized momentum over perfection. Commanders were told to advance with incomplete information. Delays required justification. Mistakes could be corrected. Stagnation could not. This was not a cultural change achieved through memos. It was enforced through presence, tone, and consequence. Patton made it clear that the old army would not survive Sicily. By mid-July, the 7th Army was no longer merely holding ground. It was probing, advancing, and adapting. Sicily had begun as a controlled experiment. It was turning into something else entirely. The Americans were learning, not by instruction, but by necessity. And at the center of that learning curve stood a commander who believed that war did not reward balance. It rewarded velocity. Sicily was not yet a blitzkrieg, not in the German sense, but the conditions for one were forming. The army that arrived on the beaches, uncertain and reactive, was already being reshaped into a force that would soon outrun Allied expectations and enemy planning alike. The defeat at Kasserine had exposed weakness. Sicily would determine whether that weakness became permanent or catalytic. The transformation had begun, not with triumph, but with the realization that the United States Army could not afford to fight the war it had trained for. It would have to fight the war that was unfolding in front of it. The battle for Gela was not supposed to be decisive. In Allied planning, it was a landing zone, a temporary foothold meant to funnel men and equipment inland before the campaign properly began. Instead, it became the first real test of whether the American Army had learned anything since Tunisia. What unfolded along the beaches south of Gela revealed just how thin that margin of learning still was. In the early hours after the landings, American units struggled to assemble. Weather and navigation errors scattered formations. Some infantry came ashore without heavy weapons. Others landed far from their assigned sectors. Command posts were established late, sometimes in the wrong locations. Radios worked intermittently. What should have been a controlled expansion inland became a fragmented effort to simply understand who was where. For German commanders watching from higher ground, this disorder was an opportunity. Elements of the Hermann Göring Division, one of the best-equipped German formations in the Mediterranean, moved quickly. Their response was not improvised panic. It was doctrinally sound counterattack. German armor and mechanized infantry pushed toward the beaches, aiming to fracture the landing before it could stabilize. The objective was not to annihilate American forces outright, but to drive them back into the sea or force a withdrawal under pressure. If the beachhead collapsed, the entire Western Allied lodgment in Sicily would unravel. On the ground, American infantry faced armor in conditions they were not prepared for. Anti-tank coordination was uneven. Units hesitated to reposition without orders. Reports moved slowly upward while German tanks moved quickly forward. In several sectors, the situation resembled Tunisia all over again. German momentum, American uncertainty, and a battlefield dictated by reaction rather than initiative. What prevented disaster at Gela was not superior ground tactics, it was naval firepower. U.S. Navy destroyers and cruisers moved close to shore and began firing directly into advancing German formations. Naval gunfire, coordinated through forward observers who often had only partial visibility, shattered armored thrusts that infantry could not stop alone. Tanks were destroyed. Columns broke apart. German attacks stalled, not because the Americans maneuvered better, but because the sea delivered overwhelming force at the critical moment. This mattered for reasons that went far beyond Gela itself. The Seventh Army survived its first major test, but the method of survival was revealing. Ground forces had been saved by assets operating outside their immediate control. If weather, communication, or timing had been slightly different, the outcome could have changed catastrophically. The margin for error was unacceptable. For Patton, this was confirmation, not reassurance. The lesson drawn from Gela was harsh and specific. The American Army could not afford to fight reactively. German doctrine thrived on hesitation. Counterattacks were designed to exploit pauses, to hit while command chains were still clarifying intent. Every hour spent consolidating invited pressure. Every delay allowed German commanders to re-establish coherence. At Gela, the Americans had paused because they believed consolidation was safety. The Germans attacked because they knew it was weakness. From this point forward, Patton's approach hardened. The Seventh Army would not wait to feel secure before advancing. Security would come from movement itself. The goal was no longer to hold ground until orders arrived. It was to push so relentlessly that German forces could not organize meaningful counterattacks at all. This was not recklessness. It was an understanding of tempo as protection. Gela also exposed a deeper structural issue. American junior officers had been trained to avoid mistakes, not to seize fleeting opportunities. In a fluid battlefield, that mindset was fatal. German units were not superior in numbers. They were superior in decision speed. Patton concluded that unless American officers were forced to act with incomplete information, the Army would always be one step behind. Gela became the last moment when waiting was tolerated. The terrain amplified this urgency. Roads radiating inland from Gela were narrow and easily blocked. If the Germans established delaying positions along them, progress would slow to a crawl. Patton recognized that Sicily's geography favored whoever moved first. Defensive positions could be bypassed only if movement began before defenses fully formed. Once the Germans dug in, every mile would cost time the Allies could not afford. In the days immediately after the battle, Patton began pushing his commanders harder than many expected. Orders emphasized advance over alignment. Units were told to move even if adjacent formations lagged. Coordination would be fixed later. Momentum could not. This ran counter to much of American training doctrine. But Sicily was not a training exercise. It was a race against an enemy whose objective was delay, not victory. German commanders, meanwhile, adjusted. They understood that Gela had failed tactically, but succeeded strategically in revealing American behavior. They refined their withdrawal plans, preparing successive defensive lines designed to trade space for time. The island would not be held, it would be used. Every engagement was meant to slow Allied tempo and preserve German forces for the mainland. What Gela ultimately represented was a narrow escape from repetition. The U.S. Army had not yet proven itself capable of sustained offensive maneuver. It had proven only that it could survive long enough to learn. For Patton, survival was not success. Success meant denying the enemy the ability to dictate the rhythm of battle. As the Seventh Army pushed inland from the beaches, the campaign entered a new phase. The immediate threat of collapse had passed, but the deeper question remained unresolved. Would the Americans continue to fight cautiously, allowing German withdrawals to proceed on schedule? Or would they seize the initiative and turn Sicily into a campaign of acceleration rather than attrition? The answer would emerge not at the beaches, but in what Patton chose to do next, when he decided to stop following the plan and start rewriting the campaign itself. By mid-July 1943, the Sicily campaign had settled into the pattern German commanders expected. Allied forces advanced cautiously. Contact was made. Resistance stiffened. German units disengaged methodically and fell back to the next line. It was not a rout. It was a controlled withdrawal designed to consume time. To most Allied planners, this was acceptable. Sicily was being taken. Losses were manageable. The campaign appeared to be unfolding as designed. Patton saw something very different. He saw a campaign being wasted. The original Allied plan assigned the U.S. Seventh Army a supporting role. Its mission was to protect the flank of the British Eighth Army as it drove east toward Messina. American forces were not expected to compete for decisive ground or operational initiative. They were expected to advance methodically, secure rear areas, and avoid disrupting the broader command structure. Patton followed these orders just long enough to understand their limitations. What he recognized was simple but decisive. The western half of Sicily was thinly defended, poorly prioritized by German command, and largely ignored by Allied planners. German forces in the west consisted mainly of Italian units with low mobility and limited will to fight, supported by minimal German formations tasked only with delaying actions. The terrain offered roads, ports, and airfields that were operationally valuable but politically underestimated. To Patton, this was not secondary ground. It was maneuver space. Rather than pressing east behind Montgomery, Patton pivoted west. Officially, the move was framed as a defensive necessity. Securing the western flank, neutralizing potential threats to supply lines, and stabilizing rear areas were all legitimate justifications. In practice, it was an unauthorized offensive in everything but name. Patton did not wait for full approval. He issued movement orders immediately, pushing divisions toward Agrigento, Trapani, and ultimately Palermo. The effect was immediate. Resistance collapsed faster than expected. Italian units surrendered in large numbers. German detachments withdrew rather than contest ground that was never meant to be held. What mattered was not the fighting itself, but the speed of advance. Columns moved continuously. Roads were seized before demolitions could be prepared. Ports were captured intact. Airfields fell without prolonged engagement. Palermo was the turning point. Its capture was not just symbolic. It was logistical. From Bonai, Palermo was a deep-water port capable of supporting sustained operations. By taking it weeks ahead of Allied schedules, Patton fundamentally altered the supply equation of the campaign. The Seventh Army no longer depended solely on vulnerable beach supply chains. It could now draw directly from a major port, shortening transport distances and increasing operational tempo overnight. This was the moment Sicily stopped being a learning exercise and became a maneuver campaign. With Palermo secured, Patton had freedom of action that Allied command had not planned for. His army was supplied, mobile, and operating in areas the enemy had already written off. German commanders now faced a dilemma: continue an orderly withdrawal while an American force moved unopposed through their rear areas, or divert combat units to slow an advance that was not part of their original defensive calculations. Patton did not pause to consolidate. He immediately pivoted east along Sicily's northern coast. This was the most difficult terrain on the island. Mountains pressed against the sea. Roads were narrow and exposed. Defensive positions could dominate movement. Under traditional doctrine, this would have required careful preparation and deliberate assaults. Patton rejected that approach entirely. Instead, he introduced a pattern that would define his later campaigns. Limited frontal pressure fixed German units in place, while amphibious landings leapfrogged defenses along the coast. Each landing threatened encirclement. Each threat forced withdrawal. German units abandoned prepared positions not because they were defeated, but because staying meant isolation. Terrain that favored defense was rendered irrelevant by maneuver. This was not accidental brilliance, it was systematic exploitation of German priorities. German commanders were focused on preserving forces for Italy. Patton understood this and used it against them. He did not need to destroy divisions. He only needed to move faster than their evacuation timetable. Every mile gained reduced German flexibility. Every day saved increased Allied pressure on the Strait of Messina. At the same time, the internal culture of the Seventh Army was changing rapidly. Commanders who hesitated were bypassed. Units that moved aggressively were reinforced. Patton made it clear that initiative would be rewarded and delay punished. This was not a motivational slogan. It was enforced through command decisions. Momentum became the only acceptable justification for risk. This approach inevitably created friction with Allied command, particularly with Montgomery. The British advance in the east slowed against well-prepared German defenses. Patton's advance in the north appeared faster, not because it faced weaker opposition, but because it refused to fight the battles the enemy wanted. The rivalry was political, but the implications were operational. Two Allied armies were now competing not just for ground, but for tempo. By breaking the script, Patton had transformed the Sicily campaign. What began as a controlled advance was now a race. German commanders were forced to accelerate withdrawals. Allied planners were forced to react to success they had not anticipated. The Seventh Army was no longer learning how to fight. It was learning how to move. This was the real birth of Patton's method, not speeches, not bravado, but the deliberate choice to treat speed as a weapon and hesitation as the enemy. Sicily had not yet been won, but the logic of the campaign had already shifted. From this point forward, the question was no longer whether the island would fall, but how quickly the enemy could escape it. And Patton intended to make that escape as costly and as incomplete as possible. The capture of Palermo did more than expand the American footprint in Sicily. It changed the character of the war being fought on the island. Until that moment, the campaign had followed a familiar Allied pattern: advance, pause, consolidate, repeat. Palermo shattered that rhythm. What Patton seized there was not just a city, but operational freedom. Palermo fell with far less resistance than Allied planners had predicted. Italian units melted away. German forces, already committed elsewhere, chose withdrawal over engagement. The speed of the advance left little time for demolitions or organized defense. Warehouses, port facilities, and transportation infrastructure were captured largely intact. This was decisive. For the first time in the campaign, an American field army possessed a major logistical hub deep inside enemy territory. The implications were immediate. Supply lines shortened dramatically. Fuel, ammunition, and rations no longer had to crawl inland from exposed beaches over congested roads. Trucks turned faster. Units stayed mobile longer. Repair and recovery became more efficient. The Seventh Army's ability to sustain continuous movement increased overnight. What had previously been a constraint now became an advantage. This shift altered German calculations as well. Palermo's loss signaled that the western half of Sicily was no longer a buffer. It was an avenue of approach. German command had assumed that any serious Allied effort would remain focused in the east, where terrain and prepared positions could delay advances. Patton's seizure of Palermo invalidated that assumption. The Americans now threatened German rear areas and withdrawal routes along the northern coast. As the Americans advanced, rivalry with the British Eighth Army intensified. Montgomery's forces faced the heaviest German defenses on the eastern axis. Progress was slower, deliberate, and costly. Patton's rapid movement along the north created political tension but operational pressure. German commanders now had to contend with two Allied advances operating on different timelines. There withdraw rather than regroup or slow down, Patton accelerated. Within days, elements of the 7th Army were moving eastward along the coast road toward Messina. This route was among the most defensible on the island. Mountains rose sharply from the sea. Roads clung to cliffs and passed through narrow towns that favored ambush. Under conventional doctrine, such terrain demanded methodical clearing operations. Patton refused to be trapped into that rhythm. He applied pressure selectively. Frontal attacks fixed German units just long enough to identify their positions and intentions. Then maneuver followed. Amphibious landings leapfrogged defenses, landing infantry behind enemy lines or on undefended stretches of coast. Each landing threatened encirclement rather than destruction. German commanders, focused on preserving forces for the mainland, chose withdrawal every time. This pattern repeated itself along the coast. Positions that could have cost weeks were abandoned in days. Prepared defenses became irrelevant when bypassed. German units retreated in good order, but at a pace dictated by Patton's movements, not their own plans. The campaign was no longer about defeating German formations in place. It was about forcing them to move before they were ready. Inside the 7th Army, the transformation was unmistakable. Units that had hesitated at Gela now operated with confidence. Junior officers made decisions without waiting for detailed guidance. Command posts displaced forward as fast as supply allowed. The Army no longer paused to ask whether it was safe to advance. It advanced until stopped. This new tempo did not come without cost. Casualties occurred in difficult terrain. Supply columns were stretched thin. Coordination between units sometimes lagged behind movement. But Patton accepted these risks as preferable to stagnation. He understood that every operational pause benefited the enemy more than the attacker. Speed reduced German options. Delay multiplied them. AWOL plans became increasingly compressed. By late July, the race to Messina had begun in earnest. For Patton, Messina was not just a geographic objective. It was the choke point through which German forces would escape to the mainland. Capturing it first meant cutting off withdrawal routes or at least accelerating evacuation under pressure. Time, not territory, became the decisive factor. Palermo marked the moment when the 7th Army ceased to be a supporting force and became an independent operational actor. Patton had taken an army expected to learn slowly and forced it to adapt at speed. Sicily had become a test not of firepower, but of velocity. The campaign was now defined by movement. German forces were retreating faster. Allied plans were being rewritten on the fly. The outcome of Sicily was no longer in doubt. The only remaining question was whether Patton could reach the end of the island before the enemy escaped with his army intact. The answer would be decided in the final phase of the campaign, along the narrow roads, coastal waters, and contested landings that led to Messina. The northern coast of Sicily was designed by terrain to slow armies down. Mountains pressed tightly against the sea, forcing movement into narrow corridors where a single blown bridge or blocked road could halt an entire division. Towns were clustered along the coast, each one a potential strong point. Inland routes were worse, steep, winding, and unsuitable for heavy traffic. For defenders, it was ideal ground. For an attacker bound by doctrine, it was a trap. Patton treated it as neither. As the 7th Army turned east from Palermo, German commanders expected the advance to bog down. Their delaying units were positioned to exploit terrain, not to win battles. Roadblocks, rearguards, and artillery ambushes were intended to consume time. If they could slow the Americans even slightly, evacuation plans across the Strait of Messina would remain viable. The assumption was that the Americans would fight the terrain the way doctrine prescribed, carefully, sequentially, and slowly. Instead, Patton attacked the problem laterally. Rather than forcing his army through every defended town, he treated the coast as a series of movable obstacles rather than fixed ones. When resistance stiffened, he did not concentrate forces for a prolonged assault. He applied just enough pressure to pin German units, then went around them. Amphibious landings were launched behind defensive positions, sometimes with minimal preparation and limited intelligence. These landings did not aim to destroy German formations. They aimed to make staying in place untenable. This method exploited a German priority that Patton had identified early. German commanders in Sicily were not fighting to hold ground at all costs. They were fighting to preserve forces for Italy. Encirclement, even the threat of it, carried disproportionate weight. When faced with the possibility of being cut off from withdrawal routes, German units withdrew immediately, abandoning positions they could have defended for days or weeks. Each leap forward compounded the effect. German withdrawals exposed new stretches of coast. Roads that were meant to be defended became evacuation routes instead. The tempo of movement began to outpace German planning cycles. Rear guards were forced to disengage sooner than intended. Demolitions were rushed or incomplete. The margin for orderly withdrawal narrowed with every mile Patton advanced. Inside the 7th Army, this phase cemented a new operational mindset. Units no longer expected linear progress. They expected sudden changes in direction, rapid redeployment, and incomplete information. Orders emphasized objectives, not methods. Commanders were given intent and expected to find routes. The old habit of waiting for alignment dissolved under pressure. This adaptability mattered because the coast punished rigidity. When traffic snarled on narrow roads, columns diverted inland without waiting for clearance. When supply lagged, units moved with what they had, trusting resupply to catch up. Patton accepted temporary disorder as the price of sustained momentum. German commanders, by contrast, were forced into increasingly reactive decisions. The Germans still fought well. Rearguard actions were disciplined. Artillery was effective. Casualties mounted on both sides. But the strategic equation had shifted. The Germans were no longer trading space for time on their own terms. Time was being stolen from them. Each forced withdrawal shortened the window for evacuation across the strait. By early August, the race to Messina dominated every decision. For Patton, reaching the city first meant more than prestige. Messina was the funnel through which German forces would escape. If pressure could be applied hard enough, fast enough, evacuation could be disrupted, supplies abandoned, and formations fragmented. Even partial interference would matter. Every unit lost or disorganized in Sicily would be a unit missing in Italy. The northern coast advance also exposed the limits of Patton's method. Amphibious operations strained naval coordination. Weather imposed delays. Supply columns were pushed to their limits. Not every bypass worked cleanly. Some German units escaped narrowly. But the cumulative effect remained decisive. The Germans were moving because they had to, not because they chose to. As the 7th Army closed on Messina, the campaign reached its final compression point. Geography narrowed options for both sides. The Germans accelerated evacuation efforts. Patton accelerated movement. The outcome was no longer about winning battles. It was about who could move faster in the closing days. Sicily had become exactly the kind of war Patton believed in, a contest of momentum, where speed replaced mass and initiative replaced caution. What remained was the final approach, where rivalry, exhaustion, and strategic consequence would converge at the edge of the mainland. By the time American forces approached Messina, the outcome of the Sicily campaign was no longer in doubt. The island would fall. What remained uncertain was the quality of that victory. Would German forces escape intact, Or would pressure and timing inflict lasting damage? For Patton, Messina represented the final chance to turn speed into strategic consequence. German commanders had anticipated this moment from the beginning. Sicily had never been intended as a place to make a final stand. It was a delaying ground, a buffer that would buy time to reinforce southern Italy. As Patton drove east, evacuation across the Strait of Messina intensified. Ferries, barges, and small craft moved men, vehicles, and equipment under constant threat from air and naval attack. The operation was conducted with discipline and urgency. The Germans were not panicking. They were executing a plan. Patton understood that a complete cutoff was unlikely. The strait was narrow, well-prepared, and heavily defended. What he could influence was tempo. Every hour of pressure forced German units to evacuate under worse conditions, with less equipment and in greater disorder. The objective was not annihilation. It was degradation. As the Seventh Army closed in, movement became frantic. Units advanced along parallel routes, converging on the city from different directions. Roadblocks and rear guards were encountered and pushed aside as quickly as possible. There was no pause to fully clear terrain. Every decision was weighed against time. The question was no longer how to fight, but how fast. On August 17, 1943, American troops entered Messina just hours before British forces, advancing from the south. The city had fallen, but German forces were already crossing to the mainland. Patton had won the race, but the enemy had largely escaped. This result was controversial. Critics argued that Patton's aggressive maneuver had failed to deliver decisive destruction. Supporters countered that the campaign had forced the Germans to evacuate under constant pressure, abandoning equipment and suffering losses they could not easily replace. Both assessments were partially true. What mattered more was what Sicily had revealed. The Germans emerged in Italy with experienced troops, but reduced resources. Vehicles were lost. Heavy equipment was left behind. Units arrived tired and under strength. The defensive battles that followed on the mainland would reflect these constraints. Sicily had not destroyed German forces, but it had shaped the conditions under which they would fight next. For Patton, the significance of Messina was personal and institutional. He had demonstrated that the American Army could conduct high-tempo maneuver operations against a competent enemy. He had done so by rejecting doctrinal caution and embracing speed as a form of control. The Seventh Army that reached Messina was not the force that had landed at Gela. It was faster, more confident, and less dependent on centralized direction. The rivalry with Montgomery added a political dimension to the outcome. Patton's arrival in Messina first became a symbol of American capability and ambition. It also intensified tensions within Allied command. Success had come not from adherence to the original plan, but from deviation. This raised uncomfortable questions about how future campaigns should be fought. The German evacuation, though tactically successful, underscored a strategic shift. The Allies now possessed the initiative. The Axis could no longer choose where to fight without constraint. Sicily had forced the war onto the Italian mainland, opening a new front that would drain German resources and attention. Messina marked the end of the campaign, but not the end of its influence. The methods refined there would reappear in Normandy, France, and beyond. Speed, bypass, and pressure would become hallmarks of American operational doctrine. Patton had not invented these concepts, but he had proven they could work with American forces. Sicily closed with an ambiguous victory. The island was taken. The enemy escaped. Yet the balance of competence had shifted. The United States Army was no longer learning how to fight. It had learned how to move. What remained was the cost of that transformation, and the price Patton himself would soon pay for pushing an army faster than its institutions were ready to accept. Victory in Sicily came with consequences that were not measured in miles or casualties. The transformation of the Seventh Army had been rapid, effective, and unforgiving. It produced momentum, but it also generated strain on soldiers, on commanders, and on Patton himself. The very intensity that forced the Army forward began to expose fractures beneath the surface. The pace Patton imposed left little room for recovery. Units moved continuously, often fighting in difficult terrain with limited rest. Supply chains, though improved after Palermo, were still stretched by constant motion. Fatigue accumulated faster than it could be relieved. For many soldiers, the pressure was relentless. Fear was no longer episodic, it was sustained. Patton believed that combat effectiveness depended on momentum and discipline. He viewed hesitation as contagious and fear as something to be confronted directly. This philosophy shaped his interactions with subordinates and wounded soldiers alike. In his view, allowing emotional collapse threatened the cohesion of the entire force. War, as he understood it, rewarded hardness. This belief culminated in the incidents that nearly ended his command. During visits to field hospitals in Sicily, Patton encountered soldiers suffering from what was then termed battle fatigue. To modern eyes, these were clear cases of psychological trauma. At the time, understanding was limited and stigma was high. Patton reacted harshly. He saw these cases not as injuries, but as failures of discipline. In 2 separate incidents, he struck soldiers and berated medical staff, accusing them of sheltering cowardice. News of the incidents traveled quickly up the chain of command. When they reached Allied headquarters, the reaction was severe. Patton was reprimanded. He was ordered to apologize. More importantly, his future was placed in question. The same qualities that had driven the 7th Army forward were now seen as liabilities. From a purely operational standpoint, the timing was cruelly ironic. Patton had just demonstrated that American forces could conduct aggressive maneuver warfare. He had delivered results beyond expectations. Yet the institutional response focused not on the campaign's transformation, but on the cost of his methods. Allied leadership faced a dilemma. Patton was effective but politically volatile. The U.S. Army was still shaping its identity in coalition warfare. Public confidence mattered. Discipline mattered. The slapping incidents threatened both. As a result, Patton was sidelined during the planning for the next major operation. He would not command American forces in the initial phases of the invasion of Normandy. This pause did not erase his influence. The army he shaped in Sicily carried his methods forward even in his absence. Emphasis on speed, initiative, and pressure had taken root. Officers who had learned to move without waiting did not forget the lesson. Doctrine began to catch up with practice. The cost of speed, then, was not only personal. It revealed a deeper tension within the American military system. Rapid adaptation in war often clashes with institutional comfort. Patton forced change faster than the system could absorb it. Sicily proved that his approach worked. It also proved that it was disruptive. In retrospect, the slapping incidents became symbolic of this contradiction. They overshadowed operational success and narrowed the narrative of the campaign. But they did not negate what had been achieved on the battlefield. The 7th Army left Sicily fundamentally altered regardless of Patton's temporary fall from favor. Sicily closed with an army transformed and a commander in exile. The island had taught the Americans how to fight at speed. The next question was whether that lesson would be fully applied when the war returned to France. Patton would not be present on the beaches of Normandy, but the war he would later fight there had already been shaped by what happened in Sicily. When the guns fell silent in Sicily, the campaign was quickly framed as a stepping stone, important but transitional. In official histories, it became a prelude to Italy and a footnote to Normandy. That framing missed the point. Sicily was not important because it was won. It was important because it rewired how the American Army fought the war. Before Sicily, U.S. forces treated combat as a sequence of problems to be solved in order. secure the beach, build the supply base, advance to contact, pause, reorganize, repeat. This approach assumed time was neutral. Sicily proved it was not. Time belonged to the enemy unless it was seized. What Patton forced into existence was an army that understood tempo as control. Movement was no longer something that followed success. It became the mechanism that created success. Units learned that advancing aggressively often reduced resistance rather than increased it. German forces withdrew not because they were defeated tactically, but because staying in place became operationally dangerous. This lesson mattered far beyond the island. In Sicily, American officers learned to act with incomplete information. They learned that perfect coordination was less important than sustained pressure. They learned that bypassing strong points could be more effective than destroying them. These were not abstract ideas. They were habits formed under stress, reinforced by results, and carried forward into later campaigns. German commanders recognized the change as well. Post-campaign assessments noted that American forces were no longer predictable. They moved faster than expected. They shifted axes of advance without warning. They exploited gaps rather than battering fronts. This forced German planners to allocate reserves earlier, withdraw sooner, and accept greater risk elsewhere. The balance of initiative began to tilt. Sicily also clarified the limits of German defensive logic. Trading space for time worked only if the enemy accepted the trade. Patton refused. By accelerating the campaign, he compressed German withdrawal schedules and forced evacuations under pressure. The result was not annihilation, but attrition of capability. Lost vehicles, abandoned equipment, exhausted units. These losses reappeared later in Italy, where German forces fought with fewer resources and less flexibility. For the American Army, the most enduring change was cultural. Junior officers who had survived Sicily were no longer waiting for permission to act. They had seen that hesitation was punished more reliably than mistakes. This mindset would resurface in France in 1944, when American units exploited breakthroughs faster than Allied planners had anticipated. The speed of the Third Army across France did not emerge spontaneously. It was rehearsed in Sicily. Patton's personal role in this transformation was complicated. He was removed from the spotlight, just as his methods were being validated. Institutionally, the Army distanced itself from his excesses while quietly absorbing his lessons. This dual response allowed the system to evolve without fully embracing the man who forced the change. In the end, Sicily was not Patton's greatest victory in terms of territory or casualties inflicted. It was his most important contribution to how the United States fought World War II. He took an army that had failed under pressure and forced it to adapt at speed. He proved that American forces could maneuver aggressively against a capable enemy. He demonstrated that war could be won by denying the enemy time, not just by inflicting losses. The island fell. The Germans escaped. But the war that followed was shaped by what Sicily revealed. When Patton returned to command in 1944, leading the Third Army across France, observers would marvel at the speed, audacity, and momentum of the advance. Those qualities did not appear suddenly. They were forged under fire a year earlier on a rugged island where hesitation nearly proved fatal and velocity became doctrine. Sicily was where the American Army stopped learning how to fight and started learning how to move. Sicily did not end with Patton's removal from command prominence. It ended with his ideas embedded in the American way of war. While Patton himself was sidelined after the campaign, the operational habits he imposed did not disappear. They spread quietly, carried forward by officers and units that had learned what worked under pressure. In the months that followed, the U.S. Army institutionalized lessons it had absorbed informally in Sicily. Training emphasized rapid exploitation rather than rigid phase lines. Commanders were encouraged to think in terms of opportunities instead of boundaries. Logistics planning began to focus on sustaining movement rather than supporting static fronts. These changes were not advertised as Patton's doctrine, but their origins were unmistakable. The Italian campaign that followed revealed both the value and the limits of these lessons. Terrain, weather, and German defensive skill constrained maneuver. Speed could not solve every problem. But even there, American forces demonstrated a greater willingness to probe, bypass, and adapt than they had shown in North Africa. Sicily had expanded the Army's operational imagination. When preparations began for the invasion of France, these ideas matured further. Allied planners expected the breakout from Normandy to be slow and costly. What they did not fully anticipate was how quickly American forces would exploit success once it came. When the front finally cracked, the response was not cautious consolidation. It was acceleration. That response traced directly back to Sicily. Officers who had learned to move without perfect information did so again in France. Units that had learned to bypass resistance repeated the pattern on a larger scale. Logistics officers who understood that supply existed to enable motion-stretched systems to keep up. When Patton finally returned to command, leading the Third Army, he found an institution far more receptive to his instincts than it had been a year earlier. The famous dash across France in 1944 was not an anomaly. It was the culmination of a learning process that began in failure and was refined in Sicily. What appeared to be brilliance was, in reality, rehearsal applied at scale. Sicily also clarified something more fundamental. Modern warfare was no longer about destroying enemy forces alone. It was about overwhelming their ability to react. By compressing time, Patton forced German commanders into decisions they did not want to make sooner than they wanted to make them. That principle would define Allied success in the latter half of the war. In retrospect, Sicily stands as the hinge point in Patton's wartime career and in the American Army's evolution. It was the moment when speed stopped being a personality trait and became a system. The island did not fall because the Americans were stronger. It fell because they learned to move faster than the enemy could adjust. Patton's transformation of defeat into momentum did not end in Sicily. It reshaped how the United States fought World War II from that point forward. If this campaign surprised you, it's because Sicily wasn't meant to be remembered this way. It wasn't a famous stand or a decisive encirclement. It was a transformation. An army that failed learned how to move, and once it did, the war changed. If you want to understand how battles are really won, not by speeches, not by myths, but by systems, timing, and pressure, subscribe to the channel. This is WW2 Battles, where we break wars down to how they actually worked. In the next video, we follow this lesson forward into France, where speed stopped being an experiment and became a weapon. Like the video if you value deep, fact-driven history. Subscribe if you want battles explained without legend or fluff.